We are just going to give it a few minutes as people start trickling in, and then we'll get started. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started since we have about an hour on our time contract here. And as folks start showing up, that's fine. We also, just as a reminder, this is fully recorded and gets posted to our website. A lot of the attendees actually prefer to watch this after the fact, just given schedules and whatnot. So thanks for joining us today. This is a pretty exciting webinar topic. So before I introduce Glenn in just a moment, just want to go over some ground rules and our objectives for today. So first things first, as you guys should see on the right hand, there's basically sort of a panel. This is where you can type questions in. I'll be the one who's moderating those. We will do our best to get through those, and I will try and pulse those in at the right time in the conversation. As I said, this will certainly be recorded, and again, is something that I encourage you guys, the free resource, to share with your colleagues, peers, etc. We have typically a lot of downloads and requests after the fact. Wonderful. So today here, we're really going to be talking about how different funding strategies for asset management programs. As Utility Cloud, we provide a SaaS-based offering that helps utilities manage their infrastructure and the work associated with that infrastructure, making sure that you're doing the right work at the right time for the right reason. And with us today, we have Glen Barnes. Glen, if you wouldn't mind, just kick off, tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? What's your experience? How can you help?
Well, Dan, thank you so much for having me on the webinar today. I'm always excited to talk about asset management, always excited to talk about utility finance, and grateful for the opportunity. And just also want to say thank you to all of you for taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us today. So my name is Glen Barnes. I've been working in the utility finance space for the last 15 years. Currently, I'm the director of an organization called Water Finance Assistance, and as our name may imply, we provide training and technical assistance to drinking water utilities about how to pay for their programs and their infrastructure needs. So in particular, we do a lot of focus on accessing infrastructure funding. So we help communities try to look under all the rocks, figure out what an appropriate funding source might be, or how they can fund infrastructure improvements, asset management out of their own budgets. We look at affordability of water services and rate setting. We do a good bit of work about workforce planning. So, we tend to think of asset management as physical infrastructure, but I think our employees are some of the most important assets that we have. And if you're like a typical utility, some of them are nearing retirement age, maybe a lot of them are nearing retirement age. And so that's something we take a look at and actually kind of take the principles of asset management and apply it towards a workforce setting. And then we have a special area, focus area with tribal water utilities as well. So we do a lot of work with tribal utilities and some of the unique needs that they face. So I've been in this space, like I said, for about 15 years, and we are always excited to meet utilities and talk to them about their finance and management needs and see if there's any way that we can help. And doing these types of webinars is a big part of what we do. So Dan, again, I'm very grateful for you all to have us on today. And just want to say a quick shout out to the CEO of our organization. You can see her lying on the bed, sleeping behind me. Anybody who has a cat knows who the boss is, and it's not you. So we'll see if Molly wakes up at some point. But anyway, just one of the joys of, you know, the small good things that's come out of COVID, I know, is we all get to see all these little intimate peeks into people's lives. So, you know, my boss back there sleeping away soundly.
That's hysterical. Awesome. Well, good. Glenn, again, really glad to have you on here. So guys, we basically have three main topics here that we're going to go through. And before I kick the first one off, first we're going to take a look at just let's call it internal financing. So when we're making room for budget, based on the resources you as a utility already have. So that's like, how do we make the case? How do we find room? What are some of the levers that you can pull without going to external sources? The second is going to be in the space of asset management grants. So most states, some in different capacities than others, allow for utilities to access these grants to pay for either part or full pieces of your asset management program. And then lastly, we're going to actually talk about the infrastructure package. This is kind of a bonus topic. This is what is this thing? What could it possibly mean for us, and when? So those are kind of the three main topics. And number three, there's been a lot of chatter specifically on the lead and copper rule and infrastructure funding that has or will be coming available for that specifically. So we'll make sure that that's sort of a sub bullet of that. So let's go straight into making room in the budget. So Glenn, I'm sure you've heard this case before. We talk to a lot of utilities, and a pretty common, I could give you an exact percentage if I had to, of folks that we talk to say, yeah, I see value in a software like Utility Cloud. In fact, I think we really need it to better manage our infrastructure. I understand the benefits, but we don't have funding. I think maybe we'll go broad first, and then we'll go specific. What are some of the pieces of advice that you would give to someone in that position, and where are some of the places that they might go first to figure out either how to make that case and subsequently how to get that money?
Yeah, and Dan, I think this is a really good place to start with. And I always like to, as much as we all love free money, you know, I think there's not a lot of it, as we'll get to a little later in the hour. So it's always important, I think, to start the conversation thinking about our internal capacity to take on certain types of expenses. So let me just first, as a way of getting into this question, take a quick step back. I assume anybody listening to this webinar doesn't need a hard sell as to why it's important to do asset management, but I do think one of the main reasons that I always say, if I'm working with a community and we're talking about asset management and say they've not done anything around asset management before, maybe they're not even really familiar with it as a concept, I always say there's a very important assumption built into asset management, which is that you do not have unlimited amounts of money at your disposal. Because, you know, if you were the Bill Gates water company, if you were Amazon Water, you wouldn't need asset management, because if something broke, you would just write a check and replace it, and you would not have financial constraints. Now, the reality for us as utilities is we don't have billions of dollars sitting in the bank at our disposal at any given time. So we know that we have to spend a limited amount of money on infrastructure. And oftentimes, if you sat down and wrote out a list of assets that needed to be replaced or you thought needed to be replaced, and then you put a budget to it, it's going to be more than your actual amount of money that you have in a given year. So where asset management provides you the biggest benefit is saying, okay, with limited dollars, what's the first project I should do? What's the second project I should do to get the biggest bang for the buck? And maybe I can't get through the whole list, but I'm going to do the ones that are going to be the most urgent, the most able to protect public health, et cetera. So that's kind of the big goal of asset management in my mind. Now, how that relates to getting into the budget is when I talk with utilities and they say, look, we just don't have the money to do X. Well, that's sometimes true and sometimes not. Because I think, like, if you go to a small town and they say, look, we do not have the money. I think William Shatner is going to space today. So like, we do not have the money to put William Shatner in space. They're probably telling the truth. They don't have the money to do that. But realistically, what they're facing is how they're prioritizing spending the money that they have right now. So a little bit of the question of getting money into the budget is, how do we prioritize spending money on asset management versus spending it on other priorities? And let's not sugarcoat it. It is a choice between spending money on asset management versus spending money on something else. And so there's a certain amount of money that you're going to have within the budget every year, I hope, dedicated towards infrastructure improvement, dedicated towards maintenance and tracking of assets and tracking of work orders, things of that nature. So you have to make a decision as a utility. How important is maintaining an asset management plan compared to some other things that we could spend money on? And what's the benefit of that relative to just, well, I've just got to spend money. I've just got to fix leaks. I've just got to do this or that. Now, there are smart ways that you can prioritize how you spend money, and there are dumb ways. So, I don't want the message of this to be, oh, well, you can just, prioritize this above everything else. Because if you think like, all right, I know how I'm going to find money for an asset management program, we're going to fire our most experienced operator. He costs too much money. We'll just go with the new guys we hired, and we'll go with a reduced crew. We'll be fine. That's a terrible idea. Don't do that. If you think like, I'm gonna pay for asset management by stopping preventative maintenance, well, then you're gonna desperately need asset management because you're gonna have a lot of emergencies. So you've got to think about what priority do I want to give to spending this money, and can I make it work in the budget compared to some other things? Because the advantage of asset management, again, is it's going to help you target your limited dollars in the best way possible, and over the long term, that'll help save you some money.
Yeah, I liked a lot of the things you said there, Glenn. I think one of the things that's important there is the concept of like, I don't think people can afford not to have asset management. It seems like it's that cycle that you're describing, right? Of like, if we're going to continue to need to spend the same level on repairs, on overtime, whatever those things are that are making your operation really expensive, hey, we're never going to get a handle on those things, and hence our budget will always be this thing if we don't adopt a program sooner. I think the tough thing, and you and I had talked a little bit about this, is firing your most experienced operator, there might be a hard cost savings there. It's a terrible idea. You should never do it. But I think people are looking for that, like, what are my immediate hard cost savings? And there probably aren't a ton of hard cost savings. Can you think of any that are something where it's like, that if you just need to, if you need to find your way out of that cycle and you just need to free up 20 grand, if you were in their shoes, what would your case to be and to whom in order to get just that amount of money? And of course it matters on the size. 20 grand to one utility is not the same to another, but where would you go and what would you say?
Yeah, so I think, I think, Dan, you're absolutely right about this vicious cycle that you get into, because there's utilities that I've worked with over the years that they will freely confess that their capital improvement plan, their asset management plan is, we wait for something to break, we hope it doesn't break, and then if it does, we desperately scramble to figure out what's going on. And all we ever do is put out fires, and it's
Yep.
very demoralizing. It's not a great situation to be in, and it's very expensive. So you're right, if you can invest some in asset management and that helps you replace assets proactively, ideally you're going to be able to avoid some of those costs of overtime and emergencies and maybe having to truck in water and deal with some of those other issues. But certainly there are other places where you can look for operational savings. So I know a number of utilities, for example, might look at the energy use of their water system. Maybe they have some older pumps and motors, or even the lighting in their treatment plant, where yes, they're going to spend a little bit of money to get something newer right away, but it's going to generate avoided energy costs immediately. And that's a real potential immediate benefit. There are other types of operational improvements. Now, I'm a finance guy. I'm not a certified water operator. I'm not an engineer. That's not my background. But I will say it's not hard to find companies out there that specialize in operational efficiency, and there are good groups doing really good work in that space that a utility could tap into that would help to they talk about it, a lot of them, is finding money in your budget you don't realize is there. So in other words, like small changes here or there, some of them may be new equipment, some of them may be process changes. It may not cost you anything, it's just running your system a little bit differently. That can help you free up some money. So looking at energy use, looking at operational efficiencies, I think are some good places to start. And then the other one that I really encourage utilities to look at is water loss. So if you are treating a lot more water than your customers are buying from you, it may be leaking into the ground somewhere, it may be your meters are old, but that's dollars that you're losing. And again, there may be a way to prioritize some of your maintenance, if it is leak repair, or prioritize meter replacement if it looks like it's apparent water loss. And that can start to generate some money fairly quickly for your system as well. So there are a few places to look for where you can tighten up your operations and start to save a bit of money.
Yeah, I think that's great. Glenn, if you wouldn't mind, I just wanted to show what you're talking about. Sort of jogged my mind here on a framework that we talk about with some of our customers and prospects. I'm just going to share my screen very briefly here. Just want to make sure. Can you see this? Just want to make
Yes,
sure.
I can.
Okay, good. Yeah. So this is sort of a framework to think about the avoided costs of implementing an asset management program. So just to orient the sort of the framework, it's basically you have issues here on the sort of y-axis. It's the likelihood of them happening. So low likelihood bottom, high likelihood top. And then you have across the x-axis the consequences of failure. So if it goes wrong, how bad is it? And what the way that we typically see it with utilities, I think there's a great way to frame this up, by the way, to leadership internally, is that, hey, the stuff in the bottom left, so first of all, those are not that expensive. They're more like little annoyances. and hey, we know it's okay. We're never gonna get to those potentially. And then the stuff in the top right, well, that's the drop everything. That is the stuff that is extremely expensive, but people are usually on top of. I mean, that's the drop everything. You resolve it. Um, it's really I think where a lot of money is being wasted is on these other two boxes. The things that are day to day, that are happening all the time, with relatively low consequence of failure, and then the stuff that is really keeping us up at night, the stuff that has a very high consequence of failure, but it's really low likelihood of happening. So I think the stuff on the right-hand side, I think one framework I would deliver to people, is basically like, if you're trying to make a business case for this, ask yourself what things over the last 2, 3, 5 years happened that had a really high consequence of failure. Roughly speaking, how much did that cost us? And could we believe that had we had better asset management practices in place, i.e. we were getting to more preventative maintenance tasks, we were running all the right checks at the right times, what costs could we have avoided? Now, that's a hard question, but my point is it only needs to be directionally right. So that could be something like, wow, over the last 5 years, we had these emergency issues that had we been better prepared, we would have saved $1 million or $5 million or whatever that number may be. All right, transitioning to the left-hand side, this is where I think you can actually make a lot of your short-term ROIs. The stuff to the right feels to like a lot of people like very hypothetical. But the stuff on the left, like the paper cuts, there's a ton of, I think, savings, that you can justify. Again, whether when you're thinking about the budget and what buckets could we borrow from potentially to fund asset management, or just if you're trying to present an ROI to your leadership, these are the categories that we've thought of as paper cuts. And this is, again, like open to if other folks have other ideas here. These are the main categories of where there's almost certainly like day-to-day waste. Again, this is not contemplating the black swan issue where, we have a major catastrophic event that we have to spend a lot of money to replace a big asset or something like that. But the paper cuts are as follows. So this is missing work. This is work that we should be doing that we're not getting around to, that has some cost. It might be a small failure. It might be that we get a fine because we didn't report a certain result to a regulator, something like that. Double work. This is really interesting. How many? And again, I think back of the envelope numbers here is always fine. No one's gonna be perfect. Double work. What are the instances in which your folks are performing the same task twice? Actually, probably happens more often than not. Where's my work? Just the amount of time that is wasted on the question of where. So think about someone who's new to the operation, someone that's doing a new task. How much time is being wasted in that onboarding process? Of very simple, like, where is the thing that I'm supposed to be doing work on right now? Where am I supposed to go to exercise this valve? Rework, unverified work. So unverified work, let me specify what that actually means. That is, again, a cost. That's something maybe you're paying a contractor to do some work and you don't actually know that it's getting done. Huge risk associated with that. Multiple work on the same asset. Again, that's somewhat similar to double work. A schedule-based versus condition-based work. So what are the assets that you're probably paying attention to that don't need as much attention to versus the ones that do? What's the cost of missing on that? You're probably the assets that are low consequence of failure, in good shape. Not saying you shouldn't perform your preventative tasks on those, but what stuff are you not paying attention to. And then just like your straight up like data. I mean, how much time are you spending, transcribing data, spending a lot of time in Excel sheets, QAing work, going back to someone you didn't understand the value that they wrote on a piece of paper? How much time is just happening on data? And then miss revenue. I think that's the very last thing, which is for work that is billable, how many of those instances are not happening because there's not a proper system in place? So again, I didn't mean to sort of take the stage there on that, but I think when you guys think about, either finding space in the budget or you're looking at the ROI, these are really the categories where you can say, I bet you were doing some of these. Again, what do we have to believe? Maybe it's only $10,000 a year, but that adds up across all these to, $100,000.
Oh, no question, Dan. And I think, on the missed revenue, another thing to point out of like, where can we find a little bit of money is one of the areas that we focus on water finance assistance is increasing your bill payment rate. So how many of your customers are paying their bills at all, and how many are paying on time and in full? And again, I think one of the big lessons that everybody should get out of asset management is you sometimes have to spend a little money to generate more money or to save some money in the long run. And I think, the bill payment rate is something that is often ignored. I talk with a lot of utilities. I've done webinars on this. We do polling in the webinars. How many of your boards are asking you to report on this? Not very many, interestingly, so I think there are ways to look at where we're missing some money or where we're spending some money that we don't have to. And I think this is a great example of the kinds of operational efficiencies that you could be finding. We've heard the jokes with, what is it, UPS through the years, they don't make left-hand turns, their trucks or something, because they so specifically map out where to go. Well, I know plenty of crews that spend their entire day bouncing back and forth across a town because they've not necessarily lined up the work orders in a logical way. And it's small things, but small things do add up over time.
Yeah, so Glenn, couple of really good ideas that you just shared. I think one is also when you're building, this is a framework we use internally, it's like, it's being directionally right. No one's ever going to come up with the perfect math on exactly, how much money you lost from the crew, bouncing around town, going to this asset, and rather than just going right, next to it to do the next piece of work, they go to the other side of town and back. You're never going to get that precisely right. But my point is, at least a framework like this, when you think of all of those things, the answer is it's usually an order of magnitude. Like it's never the sum of all those things. I don't know exactly like the size of the utilities on the phone, but my point is that the sum of that inefficiency is not like $5,000. It's not even like close to the cost of the software. It's usually like 10 times, 15, 20 times the cost of the software. So even if you're directionally right on that, it's enough information to say, hey, we need this. Glenn, I had the bill pay rate hadn't crossed my mind. Why do you think that is? Why are people not being asked to report on this? That seems like something that would be really easy to sensitize. Like, hey, if we just nudge this percentage up a little bit, that would mean, this amount to our top line, and because that's pricing, that drops to the bottom line as well. So
yeah, well, I think if the bill payment rate is reported at all, it's about the total number of bills paid versus sent, or the total amount of money paid versus billed. Both of those are great indicators. I mean, don't get me wrong, if you're doing at least that much, you're in the right direction. But I think you can dig a little bit deeper. I mean, I worked with a utility about a year ago that, their bill payment rate calculated that way was 97, 98%, which a lot of utilities are that high. But 1 out of every 6 bills was paid late. So when we dug a little bit deeper, we found that in fact, there were a lot of late payments. Now, you may say, well, those late payments were actually generating a little bit of revenue because of the late fees that were associated with them.
Sure.
But then you look at the cost. So if somebody doesn't pay their bill on time, well, they were sending out a reminder bill. They were maybe making a phone call. They were having to do shutoffs. All of that is a cost. And certainly, I think there's better things for a utility to be doing with its time than those types of programs. So, we oftentimes what we do with the bill payment rate is we'll dig into the billing data. So, how long does it take for people to get paid once you've issued a late notice? How many late notices turn into shutoffs? Try
Yeah.
to figure out how many people just forgot, how many people are trying to unfortunately game the system, see if they can get away with not paying. And then you've got folks who are consistently struggling to pay their bills. And you get folks who normally are okay, but their car broke down this month
Yeah.
and they had a $1,500 car bill. I had one recently. Um, I'm
Sorry.
blessed enough to be able to handle that, but a lot of folks aren't. That's
Yeah.
a real hardship for a lot of people. So there are numerous ways that you can look at increasing the bill payment rate. And then, as we're obviously talking about the budget here, I don't want to miss the opportunity to say, while we're talking about how you can save a little money, this may be one of those expenses where you want to think about, rolling it into a rate increase and just increasing the revenue. Because again, over time, you're likely to spend money more efficiently with this. And, again, we talk about these controllable expenses. You've got that great checklist there. We talked about energy, we talked about water loss. One of the other really controllable expenses we don't think a lot about is what it costs us to borrow money in terms of the interest rates. So if you're in a little better financial position, if you've done asset management and you're more lined up with priority projects, you could end up getting a more favorable interest rate. And in fact, in a number of, say, state revolving fund programs, that it varies state by state, but in your state, you may actually score higher if you have an asset management plan in place than if you don't, and therefore may get access to some cheaper interest rates, lower interest rates for borrowing money.
Yeah. That's a great point. That's a really
And
good point.
and in a few states, asset management for at least some systems is already a mandate. And I think it's worth pointing out that in the AWIA, the AWIA Act of 2018, I believe it is, that all states have what's called a capacity development strategy, which is basically how do they help their systems improve their technical, managerial, and financial capacity. Well, AWIA has mandated that those state plans include a way to promote asset management. So not require, it's not a federal mandate requiring asset management, but all states have been given the task to increase the number of systems doing asset management. And I would not be surprised if we see the number of states with mandates growing. So all that is a way of saying that, yes, for sure, look at opportunities to find efficiencies on your expense side before you raise rates. That should be a standard practice no matter what your expenses are. But this may be an expense that it's worth talking to your governing board about just embracing. And if that requires a little bit of a rate increase, it may require a little bit of a rate increase.
Yeah. Yeah. These are great talking points. I mean, one of the things, not across the board, but, with folks that we talk to, we try and get the need for the decision maker for the asset management software might not be the same need or desire as the person who's approving or working with them to get the budget freed up. So I think it's like these are really good talking points in terms of speaking to that decision maker. I mean, again, like cost of capital, interest rates, like that's something that might not be on the mind of a superintendent, but again, that's a good, like those are good little tidbits to get the attention of others who need to be on board. So I think that's awesome. Glenn, let's transition. I didn't realize how we've already spent a lot of time on this, which great conversation. Let's talk about the asset management grants. So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, this is at the national level. We've done ones at the state level where it's very specific. How does it work exactly? What information needs to be provided? Give us like the broad brushstrokes. How do these typically work? Can people, like, how available? Okay, if you're in a situation where you want to get your asset management program funded, specifically, selfishly on the software side, what is, like, is this a good avenue? How do you go about it? How do you learn more? Like, where do you start, I guess is my question.
Yeah, and I think this is all great because obviously there is funding available to build up asset management. And again, thinking about the AWEA capacity development requirement, I think just as it may spur more states to come out with asset management mandates, it may also encourage states to come out with more asset management funding. So I think, it's kind of both options are there. But in general, so the big pots of money, federal programs, for example, that fund water infrastructure. So you've got the state revolving fund program. That's money Congress allocates, goes through EPA out to states and territories, and then they have some discretion on how they decide to spend it. Certainly, if you're doing a large infrastructure improvement with state revolving fund money, asset management programming can kind of get rolled into that larger pot of money. Now, often that's a loan and not a grant, so you may get some principal forgiveness. And on the USDA side, if your community is 10,000 and under, they have a water and waste disposal loan and grant program, kind of the same thing. You would not go to that program just to get asset management program funding. It would be too small for what they're looking at, but it can be a piece of a larger suite of improvements. So that's one option that's there. But then a number of states have specific pots of money around asset management. So I think you all did a webinar recently with New Hampshire. That's an example of a state that has done quite a lot on asset management. They have an asset management coordinator at the state level. They have some grant funding available. Now, that type of grant funding is really intended to help you create your asset management plan, often in these states. And I want to make an important distinction here, because asset management is both a plan and a program.
Right.
And it's a plan in the sense that, yes, you need somebody to literally pay you to do this the first time, or you need to come up with the money to do it yourself the first time, where you're doing the inventory of assets, the condition assessment, useful life, criticality analysis, all of those steps that go into it, life cycle costing, your level of service. But if you do that and you put it on a piece of paper and you stick it up on a shelf somewhere, that's not an asset management program. That's you checking off a box. The program is an ongoing expense and an ongoing effort. So a lot of times the grants are going to be there to perhaps help you get started. They're going to help you do that initial plan, help you get the ball rolling. And that's really important, because if a lot of communities say, look, we just can't get started with this, we need some help, these grants are an option. But I'm infamous, I'll say not famous, but infamous for saying this. Grants are many wonderful things. I've worked for grant-supported organizations for most of my career. I used to be a nonprofit development director, but one thing the grants are not are sustainable finance. And so, these grant opportunities at the state are going to be good in year one, but you're going to have to think about how to maintain the program over time regardless. So what I would recommend doing is one of two strategies. The first is your state primacy agency, so the group that oversees drinking water regulation in your state, or the infrastructure funding authority in your state, which are sometimes the same entity and sometimes not. They will maintain a list of available loan and grant programs. So, for example, I was just Speaking of New Hampshire, looking at their list the other day, you go to, there's a website, they have a whole set of loan and grant programs there. You can click on each one for details. One of them is asset management. There's the information. So going to that state infrastructure funding authority or state primacy agency, you're likely going to find some of the available funding. But there are two good resources that have done some of that legwork for you in terms of some of the available funding, not necessarily all of them. So one is that EPA maintains a resource called the Water Finance Clearinghouse. You can just Google it and find it. And that has some searchable features where you're going to be able to look for loan and grant programs available in states. Now, they're not necessarily as comprehensive as what your state may maintain, because a lot of state programs pop up here and there, but they are one kind of centralized resource, good place to start, and then that may direct you to a website at the state to get more information. And then another kind of similar resource is maintained by the Environmental Finance Center network. And so if you find their website, they have a funding by state and territory page where you click on your state on a map and it will pull up in a PDF document with a list of funding sources. And that's another good place to start. Again, it kind of cuts a little of the time out of doing the research. But whether you get to the state program through one of those external sources or through your own research, eventually you're going to end up on that state page, and frankly, probably needing to pick up the phone and talk to somebody to get all the specifics about what it is that the grant would cover, when the funding cycle is, whether you can just apply for asset management or it needs to be tied to another project, whether you need an engineering firm to be submitting an application and what's involved with that. So you're going to have to do a little bit of research on this to really find the most appropriate funding source. And you may find after that research that your state does not actually have anything that really is going to work for you. So there's no guarantees that it's there, but it's a good practice to do that looking. And that's a great year one potential funding source. But beyond that, some of what we've talked about in the first half hour, you're going to need to start thinking about to maintain that program over time.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Glenn, you mentioned New Hampshire as like one of the states with a big, dedicated, person who's really focused on asset management. What are some of the other states in your mind that sort of pop for, being particularly on top of this, either have a lot of money or that are forward thinking on it? What are some of those?
Yeah, well, certainly, Ohio has a pretty far-reaching asset management mandate. It's every water system, regardless of size. And, most of the folks listening in, I assume you're probably from community water systems, but there are these things called non-community water systems as well. They have to do asset management plans. It's quite a comprehensive law, and they do have, I believe, some funding tied to that to be able to help you. They're just a state in general that I think is very active working with systems.
Yeah.
Michigan, Connecticut, and New Jersey all have statewide asset management requirements for at least some of the water systems in the state. So again, if you're looking at a mandate, that may be a place to look. And then certainly there are other states that are very active just in terms of funding beyond some of these federal programs like the state revolving fund, that they have state level infrastructure funding and infrastructure programs. My home state of North Carolina, where I'm based, is an example of that. You've got other states like Hawaii, for example, that have really focused on trying to make it easier for smaller communities to access some of the statewide funding. So I think every state to some extent cares about this, but certainly if your state has state level funding that is supplementing the federal programs, those are probably going to be where you're going to have the most success finding some funding to be able to do asset management programming.
Yeah, that's great. All right, awesome. So that perfect overview there. Let's go into the bonus topic, since we have about 10-15 minutes left. tell us more about the infrastructure bill. I think the now, the later, what's applicable? I mean, what's you don't need to tell us what's going to happen because who knows, but like maybe today, and for someone again who's thinking about how does this impact my asset management program or even just my immediate, capital projects, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, first off, I think there's a couple of updates that lead into this. And the first is that whether or not you may be aware of it, over the past, say, 5 years, there's been a significant increase in the amount of money being allocated to the state revolving funds, to USDA's programming. That has nothing to do with the infrastructure bill. That has just been part of the federal budget cycle. We're seeing more and more money being put into infrastructure funding programs because there is a recognized need for that, which is good. And then obviously, as COVID hit in the last year and a half, we're aware that the CARES Act came out, ARPA came out. Some of that money can be dedicated towards water infrastructure, even asset management, I believe. It's not a requirement that any of it is spent on water, but it is possible. And I certainly know of a number of communities that are using some of that money to dedicate towards their water utilities and wastewater utilities. So that's been another influx of money. So we need to pay just as careful attention to the federal budget cycle as to anything else, because a lot of these programs exist perpetually. And the other thing is some of these COVID bills also set up a new temporary low-income household assistance program at the federal level that is slowly being rolled out to states that, again, would help some of your customers who have built up arrearages during the COVID time be able to get caught up on their bills. And again, that ties into the bill payment rate. So any of this that's potential revenue for the system is important. But the two big bills that have been getting the most attention are the bipartisan infrastructure bill and then what's called the reconciliation bill. So let me explain a little bit about where both of these are standing right now. So the bipartisan infrastructure bill was looking at physical infrastructure of all types, not just water and wastewater, but there was a rather significant chunk of money in there for water and wastewater. A lot of it was directed towards the state revolving fund and WIFIA programs through EPA. And then there was also a chunk of it being directed towards new loan and grant efforts around lead service line replacement. Now, that bill passed the Senate more than a month ago now with bipartisan support. I think it got most of the Democrats, if not all of them, and about 20 Republicans. So, if there's not much that it seems like these days, it's easy to get cynical about what's going on in Washington. But infrastructure is one of those things that I think people recognize is really important. It, however, has not passed the House of Representatives, because coming out of the House of Representatives at the same time is what's called the reconciliation bill, or the kind of sometimes called the social infrastructure bill. And this is $3.5 trillion. I believe the infrastructure bill was around $1.5 trillion in total spending. And the reconciliation is $3.5 trillion over 10 years, where there is additional money there for water and wastewater infrastructure, additional money for that low-income assistance program. In fact, I believe trying to make that permanent, additional money potentially for lead service lines. So a lot of the kind of stuff that we think of as water infrastructure and other physical infrastructure. But then it also included sort of broader ideas around education, childcare, health, health and hospitals, things like that. And it's, we're a nonpartisan organization, so, no comment one way or the other on it, but certainly it had strong support from some of the more liberal side or progressive side of the Democratic Party, and a little bit less support from the moderate side. And so I think what ended up happening is the House of Representatives that were supporting the reconciliation bill essentially said, well, we'll trade. Senate, you pass the reconciliation bill and we'll pass your infrastructure bill. And a few of the more moderate Democratic senators balked at that. And so Speaker Pelosi set a deadline for the end of September to get the bills passed. And obviously, here we are on October 13th, and neither of them have passed. So clearly, the votes were just not there.
Yeah.
And I think at the same time, you may be aware the federal fiscal year starts October 1st. So if they didn't pass some type of continuing resolution, the government would shut down. That got passed. Now they're dealing with the debt ceiling, which is another, kind of more immediate priority. So a little bit of what's going on with the infrastructure bills right now is they're on hold, but there's some negotiation to try to come to an agreement that everybody can be happy with on both the reconciliation side and the infrastructure bill side. So I'm not a lobbyist, but I do spend some time talking to them to try to figure out what's going on. And I think they're still feeling somewhat optimistic that something will get passed. But I think for the moment, it looked like there was an attempt to get a horse trade, if you will. You vote for our thing, we'll vote for yours. And it didn't quite come off as hoped. And so it is possible that nothing will get passed.
Hmm.
And that I don't want to think about that, because I do believe that this money is needed in the infrastructure bill. And certainly, if you're looking at lead service line replacements, I was talking with a community recently. They need to replace about 100 lines, and they're kind of in a position of like, well, should we wait and see what happens? Because we'd rather get a grant than have to borrow money to do it. Well, I mean, I think that's a perfect illustration of literally it's holding up needed improvements in some communities because we're not really sure what's going to end up happening. So I'm going to
Yeah.
keep tracking these bills. And Dan, I'll keep you informed about what's going on. And
Yeah.
others, if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me, and I can keep you all posted on where things are going. But at the moment, there's been a pause because the deal wasn't brokered and some higher priority things in DC came up.
Now, I guess one lead service line replacement and the lead and copper rule overall have been hot topics. Maybe for some folks on the call may have, have their lead service lines already implemented, may have a software that keeps that information. What advice would you give to people right now, regardless of what the future may or may not hold in terms of funding? What actions should they be taking right now?
Well, certainly, if you have not done your inventory of service lines, which is not a small process, I want to emphasize that it is not a small process. If you have not gotten that started, that is probably needs to be your highest priority right now, because you've got to figure out what all your service line material is made out of. And there's a lot of different ways that you're allowed to do that. You don't physically have to dig up every service line in your community, but you've got to start to figure out what your service lines are made out of all the way to the premises. So it's not just looking at your owned portion of the line up to the curb stop. It's got to be the entire line. So that's a heavy lift. That's something that you want to be doing. And certainly, while we would all like to get free money, quote unquote, free money to do projects, if you're finding lead service lines and you have a potential lead exposure issue in your community, you should not be waiting for Washington to get moving on things. You've got a more immediate public health threat, and that should really be directing what you're going to be deciding to move on. But if you've got a good handle on the inventory and you feel like at the moment corrosion control is dealing with the lead issue, it's not an immediate threat to public health, then you've got to take a look at what your state is asking of you to do in terms of a replacement schedule. Certainly, if you live in states like New Jersey or Michigan or others that have been more proactive at setting state regulations, you want to take a look at that and make sure you're in compliance. But there may be some opportunities for money to come down through the infrastructure bill if it gets passed. That would be grant type funding to help you out. Now, the infrastructure bill that's being debated right now that's passed the Senate includes, I believe, about $15 billion for lead service line replacement. That is not going to cover every lead service line in the country. So the other important thing is don't necessarily hold out for a grant that may not be there at the end of the day. But I understand the hesitancy of a community to say, well, if we act now or we act 6 months from now, from a public health standpoint, it doesn't make a difference, but the financial impact might be quite significant. The other thing
Yeah,
I'll point out is the revision to the lead and copper rule has also not been finalized. So we're all kind of taking action, assuming we know what's going to happen in the final rule, but that's a little bit of a wait and see as well. The Biden administration chose to delay and reopen for public comment that rule that the Trump administration had originally put forward. And so there's a little bit of a wait and see for that reason as well.
yeah, that's great. I think one overarching message I'd have to people regarding all this is like, no one knows what funding will be available when. Clearly, infrastructure is important, but I think, again, pushing the idea that getting your data in check on your assets and your work history is really the spot you need to be to set yourself up for success on any of these programs. You're gonna have, like, in order to justify or not, in order to make the right capital decisions, in order to probably apply for a lot of this grant funding, you're gonna have to go through some of that foundational work. So I think it's like, yeah, while a lot of this money is the money that may or may not be what funds the actual capital project, there's no sense in waiting on getting your shop in order. So again, not trying to make this a sales pitch, but I do think that there's a non-regretted decision, and another key sort of talking point to your leadership on these are some of the higher level points of, if we miss out on digitizing our asset management and getting our data in check, there are big risks. We might miss out on opportunities in the future. So.
And I'll say, one of our big mantras at Water Finance Assistance is around data-driven decision making. We want to encourage utilities to use the vast amount of information at their fingertips effectively to make the best policy decisions. So I think that is a really key point, is data management is going to be really important, and really collecting and using data in making decisions is important. And the other thing I'll say, with these potential historic infrastructure bills, if they do get passed, there's going to be some pressure to get money spent quickly. And money gets spent quickly when a utility can come with a project that says, we know what we need, we can demonstrate this is a need. This is, the term you sometimes hear is a shovel-ready project. Like, we
Right.
have done the legwork to be able to tell you with confidence, this is the highest priority project we have. If you can go to a funder with that kind of information, you're going to be in a much better place than going and just saying, well, tank's pretty old, we should probably deal with that. And I think having an asset management program is going to help your case to funders be stronger, because again, while these are huge numbers we're talking about, throwing around mind-boggling numbers, at the end of the day, they're not even enough money for the need that we know is out there. So it's still going to be very competitive to access these loan and grant programs when they come around. And the more data you can use to back up your case, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, that's great. And I know we're at the top of the hour here, and I actually do have a hard stop here, but Glenn, first of all, a huge thank you to you. And I think one plug for those on the phone is, as you would like, if you need help, making that case, we as Utility Cloud have a lot of resources. Additionally, if you need even more horsepower and you're looking at accessing grant funds, or it's really something that you guys want to evaluate in some detail, I want to say, Glenn's definitely an expert in this space. So I encourage you guys to reach out. I personally am happy to hop on calls with folks in your organization to help work through some of this, and I know Glenn is too. So appreciate it, guys. Thanks for the call today. We'll be closing this out. You'll actually get an email within 24 hours just on the video. Again, please pass this along to any colleagues that you think might find this helpful, and just always happy to help. So thanks, Glenn. Really appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I appreciate you having me on. And just again, to everybody listening, thanks for taking an hour out of your day. And just also thank you for what you do every day. I know water folks don't get thanked enough for the great work you do in our communities. I know you're not seeking the credit or the attention, but just know that your work is appreciated.
Yes, I agree with that. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Talk soon.
All right, take care, everybody.